a dream? It's gotta be. Not even a kid could believe in this. When am I going to let go?
Atmosphere. It's the feel of a game, its tone. A creepy atmosphere on its own can be enough to make a player feel uneasy throughout the whole experience, but it's hard to overstate how important atmosphere is in a horror game, because without it, some things just don't work. But first, let's talk about immersion. Immersion is a sense of getting absorbed into a game, how the rest of the world switches off and it's just you and it. You become your character and your mental presence is inside the game. It's important in horror games especially because if you don't feel immersed in the experience, then it's no longer you, the player, who feels in danger, and it's just a character who's in danger. Without immersion, it doesn't really matter what happens to you because you're not there. It isn't really happening. There's a few things a player can do to enhance their experience with a game before they even play it. Ever since the first time I played my first real horror game, which was Amnesia: The Dark Descent, it's recommended that I play the game with headphones in a dark room, which I've kept doing to this very day on all of the horror games I've ever played. It's immensely frustrating to see people play horror games on YouTube and get their friends around to play something spooky in broad daylight with the TV volume down low, and then they complain it isn't affecting them. The idea is to block out everything else so it's just you and the game. If there are other things distracting you, then there shouldn't be. That's not to say that even then the game will still be immersive after that. There are lots of things in games that break immersion and remind you that you're once again playing a game rather than having an experience. Bad voice acting, janky animations, glitches, things that don't make sense, bad controls, awkward combat, sound design problems, narrative issues, and many, many more things can drag you out of it time and time again, and once that immersion is broken, the game has to work pretty hard to get you invested again, and most of the time it just doesn't. And sometimes you just don't feel a connection to a game at all, which is just fine. It's not for you. Nothing you do will make you feel immersed in something you're not interested in, and that's fine. There are lots of ways games make experiences more immersive, like frictional games and their hands-on controls. Using the mouse to pull open drawers is more immersive than pushing a button to open a drawer or cupboard. The Stalker series has its A-Life system where the NPCs have schedules and do realistic things. Combat between them takes place naturally and it feels less artificial and more like a real, living, breathing world. I always found first-person perspectives were the most immersive, since it feels like you're looking through the eyes of your character to the events of the game. But it doesn't really need any of these things, they just help. I say all this because without immersion the atmosphere just won't affect you, but once you're immersed, you can soak it all in. But what makes up an atmosphere? It's often a combination of things from visual aesthetic style to music and sound design. A good atmosphere can make you feel lonely, isolated and tense, and even make environments around you feel creepy and spooky, like you're not alone. It can make you feel overbearing anxiety and hopelessness can overtake you. A good atmosphere can make you feel pure dread and despair, like the area you're in is where you'll meet your end, to the point where it takes next to nothing to scare the player because they're already on edge. In Fatal Frame you've got the dark, almost colourless wooden Japanese structures and that monotonous drone that fades in and out. It's spooky, almost supernatural, you feel lonely and cold. In Silent Hill 2, there's the intro to the town, which is murky and weird. The game has a dirty look, and with the dense fog and discordant jumble of notes, whooshing noises and jittering sounds, it's a surreal combination that makes the place feel bizarre and alien despite being so otherwise mundane. But it's important to note that nothing is happening right now. You're just there, walking through the environment. The difference between a good atmosphere and a bad atmosphere for me is how often you don't feel anything whilst nothing is happening. Games often have a point where they'll suddenly introduce the music or cue a scripted event and you know something is coming. Like Resident Evil 7 has Evelyn's room, and for the first time outside of a boss fight, the music starts to seep in, and it's one of the creepiest parts of the game. But for the rest of the time, that's the time that's important, because most games aren't exclusively made up of creepy moments. In the original Resident Evil 2, the music is constantly playing, and the sound of Claire's footsteps reverberate greatly as she walks along the corridor, and it feels oppressive. The camera angle points down on her and she seems small, and all she's doing is walking from one room to the next, not to mention the door opening screens which, whether you love them or hate them, provide tension just by existing. In the remake, there's just nothing. There's no soundtrack, the sound design makes you feel like you're walking through a police station, which is realistic, because you are, but there's nothing inherently creepy about it. The atmosphere just isn't present. The camera position aids the third-person shooter gameplay, but not the atmosphere. The doors are realistically a gateway from one room to the next with no interruptions or tension. A game like Colat has many electrifying supernatural moments, but it also has hours of just walking from one location to the next without anything to sustain the atmosphere in that time, and if the game has more nothing than something, then in my opinion it needs improving. The last thing you really want to experience in a horror game for me is boredom. The sensation that you should be frightened or tense right now, but you aren't. There's a difference between waiting for something to happen and dreading something happening. There's so many things you can do to improve an atmosphere. Things like story events can change the atmosphere. Like at the start of Sagebrush, it seems like just another country farm until the game tells you it was the place where a mass suicide took place, which changes the atmosphere immediately. Now it's not just abandoned buildings, it's the last place people lived before they took their own lives. On the other hand, Welcome to Hanwell's streets are devoid of all human life and houses are boarded up. Cars have been abandoned and all you know is that there was an anomaly. You don't know what's happened here and there's an eerie silence of the street that provides apprehension. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is filled with scripted events and small things that spook the player into feeling tense and paranoid. Footsteps from the floor above make you feel like you're not alone, and the pained noises with no identifiable source can trick you into thinking you're being followed or something is lurking nearby. But sometimes just a dark, blood-filled environment is all you really need to put a player on edge. Just, what happened here?
What's happening? Oh, it feels like my chest is going to burst. Oh. My God, Wilhelm, do something!
Accept it. We're not getting out of here.
How can you say that? Alexander, you piece of shit! Let us out of here!
Sometimes level design itself will provide all the suspicion a player needs to start feeling apprehensive to move forwards. Like long corridors in Dead Space always made me feel like something was waiting for me at the end, or would ambush me before I even made it to the end. It's important to note that not all horror games need to be constantly oppressive, experiences that drain the player. Just ask anyone who's completed Alien Isolation, but it needs to have something. Horror games need to have an atmosphere to build the rest of the experience on, and you know what comes next.